And fear gripped them all. I can only imagine if we were in that scene, how we might respond. I was speaking with the deacon this morning, and I said, what would you do if, in the middle of your entourage going to the cemetery for a burial, you heard knocking from that casket in the back? And deacon, what would you do if you heard knocking from that casket? Would you even put it in park? Or would you just let it go? It is one of those moments that really is, when you think about it, a rather frightening scene. As Jesus encounters that funeral procession. Now, remember, back in the day, there were no hearses, there were no family cars. Everybody walked from the home where the body was prepared to that place of burial, usually outside of the city. Only those who were of extreme wealth or importance were buried inside the city. And so that family would have been making its way outside of that little village of Nain, outside of Nazareth, and not too far from Capernaum. So Jesus would have known these folks. And as he encounters that procession, he joins them and places his hand on the casket. He sees the great sorrow, the great grief that the mother is enduring and all the family gathered. And he says, "Young man, get up." What a scene. They were frightened to death. They were scared. They didn't know what to do. But in the midst of all of that was going on, those who were in that funeral procession, those who had the presence of mind, began to think. And they said, wait a minute. We remember when something like this happened before. Something that our ancestors told us before with the prophet Elijah. And it was Elijah that we hear the story of in the first reading in the book of Kings, how Elijah encountered this widow whose son was ill. And the son grew progressively ill until he dies. And the mother in that story, of course, is so distraught and said, what have you done? You've come to my house, and now my son is dead. Do you have any idea what that means? And I don't even know that we really have an idea of what that meant in those days. Not only in the scene with the prophet Elijah, but also in the scene with Jesus as he encounters that funeral procession. Because in those days, the women in these stories were already vulnerable. They were already widows. They already had no head of a household by which legally they would have claim to anything. And it was only through the goodness and generosity and benevolence of their sons, who were the heirs, were they able to even have a place to live. And now, without their sons, them having died, they had no legal recourse. And it is why that over and over again we hear in the stories of Jesus how he reaches out to women and to children, because they were among the most vulnerable of society in those days. And so as we hear this story, the reality falls upon Elijah and later upon Jesus of the seriousness of this situation. Because not only did they lose their sons, they possibly have lost their own lives and the ability to live with some security and safety. So those who saw Jesus raise this one from the dead out of his coffin, remembered Elijah did the same thing. He prayed over the young man, and then that young man was raised to life. And that woman says, now I know and I believe that God has power in this world, that God can do anything, and anyone who asks something of God with a pure and sincere heart will receive what they ask. And so we come to this scene again with Jesus, who encounters the widow of Nain in that funeral procession, and he endures and experiences their loss. And he walks with them along the way and touches the coffin and says, "Young man, get up." And he begins to speak. There are, I guess, from time to time, among those directors who may not always tend to all their details in the care and preparation of a body for visitation, that sometimes an air pocket can develop. Sometimes something can happen in the midst of that, and where at some point later during the visitation there might seem to be a gasp of air come from the body. A frightening thing. But this wasn't anything like that at all, sisters and brothers. It wasn't about somebody not doing their job. This was about God not simply getting someone up, but bringing them back to life. And it was Jesus who entered into that situation to set things right. In both of those stories today, there were two people's lives who were saved in each story. Both the son who was brought to life, and the mother who was given, if you will, a new lease on life. Two people's lives were restored in each of those stories today. What are we really about when we hear these scriptures today? Jesus and Elijah both were very much aware of the importance and the dignity of human life. Not simply of giving life where life had been taken through death, but of restoring a quality of life to those who were in need and who were vulnerable. Elijah restores that both to the mother and son. Jesus restores it to the mother and son. And right relationships are restored not only within the family, but within the larger community. I think for us who are in this year 2013, when we in our Catholic psyche begin to hear words about human dignity and right to life and protection of life, we tend to go to the whole debate and the question around abortion. There's something in the political arena and the mindset of where we are as a nation right now that our minds very often go to that conversation. And if not to the conversation around abortion and the unborn and the right to life of newborn children, our minds sometimes then go to the other end, around issues of death with dignity. And the whole question that we could possibly assist someone in dying with dignity and euthanasia and call it whatever you want. But we tend to get rather polarized. And in the course of our lives and in the course of our conversations, I think we forget a whole lot about the dignity of all of us who are somewhere there in between. After we are born and before we become infirm and die, there is a quality of life and a human dignity that belongs to all of us that we do well to respect. And I think the stories today invite us to reflect on that just a bit. Because it wasn't simply about restoring life from death. It was about restoring dignity of life to the mother and the child and to those families. Dignity of life. Respecting life. That gift that is all of ours. And I think one of our realities in our world today, sisters and brothers, is that we don't necessarily respect one another as well or as deeply as we should. And I think so often that comes from a lack of respect that we might have for ourselves. We've either been told over the course of our lives, you'll never amount to anything, you're no good at this, look at yourself, how can you see that? You know, we get this negative kind of energy going on in our lives, and we begin to then have lack of respect and care for ourselves. And so what do? We eat everything in sight. We drink things to take away the pain. We put drugs in our body that we think are going to take away the hurt until we come down from that high and find that we hurt even more. We find ourselves so filled sometimes with a disrespect and even, dare I say, a self-hatred because of what others have said about us or tried to put on us. And we let that somehow soak into our lives. And we can't believe that any other way of living is possible. And we lose our own sense of self-respect and dignity and self-worth. And when we find ourselves in that kind of stinking thinking, if you will, church, it makes it very, very hard for us to respect other people. And so when I'm down on myself and I'm waiting and looking to try to get my next high or my next whatever it is that I'm looking for, and I don't have it, what do? I take from somebody else. I take their car, I take their money, I take their goods, I take their life, so that I might get what I want. And we think it might make us feel good, and we find ourselves worse off. Maybe we've not found ourselves in those situations, sisters and brothers, but we sure know that members of our family, our neighborhood, our community who have been there. We know folks who struggle with that reality. And when we encounter that, we can have a tendency to do one of two things. We can either beat them up even more and say, get your act together, don't you know what you're doing, you're causing all these problems. Or we can ignore it altogether and say, hi baby, how you doing, what's going on? Here's a little money, I know you're always needing it. And we can ignore it and cover it up and pretend it doesn't exist, that the problem isn't there. But then we find the problems only get worse. Sisters and brothers, as we hear these scriptures today and are asked to consider who we are as people filled with the dignity that is given us by God from the very moment of our life, there's some things I think we might do well to think about. First of all, to just kind of deal with the reality of our lives. You know, we can pretend, we can cover up, we can help to co-opt someone else's responsibility. We can become codependent upon those situations and get ourselves involved because we're not willing to face the reality of the situation. And it isn't always even bad things. Sometimes when good things happen to us, we can't believe it. We wait for the other shoe to drop, so to speak. Oh, I know this is a great thing, but I don't know, tomorrow's another day, something terrible is going to happen, I just know it. And we can get into that kind of self-defeated thinking that even when good things happen, bad things are along the way. Sisters and brothers, that is not reality. But we can distort our thinking into that, making that our reality, if we allow ourselves to do it. The biggest challenge, I think, for us today is to look at our lives and look at our lives honestly. The good, the bad, the ugly, the in-between, whatever is there, to be real about who we are and what's going on. There's some wonderful things happening in each of our lives today. And I know we can stand up and testify to that to one another. I know there's some struggles in each of our lives today. And we can stand up and tell that story to one another. But in all those moments, sisters and brothers, that we have to own who we are. We have to recognize what's going on. The only way we can deal with an illness or a struggle or difficulty in our life is if we admit that we've got it. The first step to recovery, those who are in that process know, is admitting that we've got a problem. To know what the reality of our life is. Yes, sometimes the bad and the difficult, but also to recognize that there is goodness that's happening too. Jesus, in that scene in the gospel today, he doesn't deny that that child died. He doesn't deny the grief of the mother or the family or the mourners along the way. What does he do? He enters into that reality and he walks with them along the way. And he touches the casket and he knows that death is real. Elijah didn't pretend that the widow's son was just sleeping. No, Elijah knew that child was dead. And what does he do? He embraces that child and takes that child to the room and prays over that child 3 times. Entering into the reality of that experience and that death. Knowing the reality of our lives and our situation, sisters and brothers, it is the first step that we all need to take. And that doesn't mean life like it's depicted on reality shows. Reality TV is not reality. It's the greatest farce and misnomer that we have in our world today. We call it reality, but I don't know where that kind of stuff happens. And I know it doesn't happen in most of our lives. Just how do we deal with and enter into the reality of our lives and recognize who we are and whose we are? That's the heart of the reality of who we are called to be in Christ Jesus, entering into our lived experience. Secondly, sisters and brothers, when we deal with that reality that's going on, we have to look and be honest about the options that are before us. When we're faced with challenges and difficulties in our lives, we can just say, well, that's just the way it is. And we want everyone else to feel bad for us, and we just kind of go along and do nothing about it. Or we find ourselves in those moments where we're faced with those realities and those struggles in our life, and we say, well, this is just the way it is. It's always been this way, and it's never going to change. We can defeat ourselves. Or we can honestly look at our lives and to see, what are my options? How do I want to live? Where do I want to be? Who do I want to become? And that's where we need to be able to share with those around us, people that we love and trust, people who are important to us, and say, look, I've got this stuff going on in my life, I don't know what to do. And how desperately we long for those who can bring some sense of normalcy in our lives and to help us to look at things objectively. And we enter into those conversations if we're strong enough, if we're courageous enough, and are willing to hear what someone else might have to say. Because sometimes when we look at those options and we look at those alternatives, we have to face some things about ourselves. Well, maybe I'm always discouraged. Maybe I always look at things negatively. Maybe I don't see that there are ways out. And it takes a good friend. It takes someone who knows us. It takes someone who loves us, who's willing to risk enough to say those things to us. You have to look at things. We have to look at things from another perspective. And so when we begin to look at things rationally and we lay them out and we say, well, I have this option, this and this and this, or I could do this and this and this, and suddenly, where we found ourselves caught in the pit of despair and not knowing what to do, suddenly the whole world has opened up in possibilities. Choices that are before us. Some of them difficult, no question. Some of them just not within our courage and our ability to respond to, no question. But until we are willing to look at all the possibilities and all the avenues that are before us, sisters and brothers, we cut ourselves off from the potential to live the life to which God invites all of us to be about. Yes, looking at the reality of our lives, looking at the alternatives before us, and we also have to allow ourselves to be touched by Christ. Touched by Christ. No matter what we face, no matter what's going on, no matter what the reality of our lives is, if we do not allow ourselves to be touched by the Lord God, and if we don't allow the Lord to enter into our experience, then we will find ourselves on that funeral procession going to bury the dead. And Jesus says, let the dead bury the dead. When Jesus enters into that situation, what happens? They allow Jesus to touch that which they thought was dead. That which they thought was lost. That which they thought had no potential of ever moving forward in new life again. Jesus comes and touches that coffin. And once that touch happens, new life comes forward. So too in our own lives, sisters and brothers, we have to allow ourselves to be touched by God. We have to allow ourselves to be open to the reality and the possibility that God can enter into our hearts and into our minds and into our lives in such a way and bring forth a healing and a new beginning that we couldn't imagine on our own. Despair comes when we can't see any possibility or any source of help outside of ourselves, because we think it all depends upon us. And that's when we find ourselves in the most difficult spot of all, because then no one can help us. There is no way out. But if we allow the Lord to touch us in the depths and the heart of who we are, then the new beginnings can happen. Life can come where there seemed to be no life. There is hope where there was hopelessness. There is joy where there was only sadness. There is possibility when all we used to see was closed doors. Allowing the Lord to enter into our lives restores a dignity to us and reminding us that we are not making this journey alone. Those mourners on that path outside of the city of Nain, they were not walking alone. The Lord was walking with them. The Lord experienced their loss, and in the midst of that conversation, in the midst of that sharing, they were able to experience new life and a new beginning. Had they not recognized Jesus, had they not allowed Him to be part of that procession, life would not have been possible. But Jesus restores life and dignity to all those who are gathered. You and I, sisters and brothers, have a dignity that is given us by God. It is the source and the heart of who we are. We're reminded over and over again by the stories of Genesis and how we are created in God's image and likeness. Male and female, God created us in God's own image to be part of this ongoing recreation and renewal of the world. But we have to believe in that dignity. We have to trust in God's Word. We have to believe that that recognition is so strong in us that it will change the way we see ourselves, and it will change the way we treat others. We need to see ourselves as good, as worthy of God's attention, worthy of God's love, worthy of God's grace. We have to believe that those gifts are there for us. And once we can see and accept and recognize that, then we can give those gifts to others because we've received. What does John tell us in the Scriptures? Love consists in this, not that we have loved, but that we know that God has loved us first. And because we have that gift first, we can then turn to others and share what we have received. Being able to recognize that dignity in ourselves is so important, that we might be able to overcome the struggles, the addictions, the power that sometimes overtakes our lives. To be able to see and recognize that dignity in others is so important for changing the fabric and the structure of our world. You know, we find ourselves in a world that is so filled with sensual pleasure and satisfying our own needs. And all of that is rooted in, sisters and brothers, is a lack of understanding of the dignity that each of us have and are called to be about. You know, what's the problem with prostitution? It's not that it breaks the law, although it is against the law. But what's the problem with prostitution? Prostitution refuses to allow us to live out the dignity that God has called us to. The dignity of one who offers themselves in service to others in that way. They've lost their sense of dignity, self-worth, and importance to allow someone to use them. Those who go in search of a relationship in that kind of context have lost the sense and worth of dignity, that they're worth more than that and capable of more than that. Pornography is such a problem for us, not because it's against the law, but because it degrades and destroys who we are. It turns a person into a thing, less than the dignity to which God has called us all to be about. Yes, using drugs and drinking too much, and eating too much, and all of those things, they become problematic for us. Why? Because they make us less than who we can be as healthy, whole, and holy persons called to live in the light of God. Today is a day when we hear about the restoration of dignity in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. The question becomes, what will we do? How can we be involved in restoring our human dignity in our own self and in one another? I think we have to face our lives. We have to look at the opportunities and alternatives before us. And we have to allow God to be part of that journey. We can't do it ourselves. But with God, all things are possible. We've heard it over and over again. Do we believe it? Do we believe it? We're told those who receive not, they receive not because they ask not. Whatever it is that you need today in church, ask God for it. Whatever it is that you want in your life, ask God for it. Whatever it is is that you need to build up your life and the life of your family and those around you, ask God for it. It's here waiting for us all today. All we need to do is ask. The widow asked Elijah to take care of her son, and he did, and brought forth life. Jesus entered into the situation along that funeral procession and brought forth life. Whatever it is that we need, whatever it is that we want, that God can give us, ask for it today. And we will receive. We will receive what we need, and a whole lot more. Not that we can hoard it to ourselves, but that what we receive, we give to others. Because God has given us so much. God's grace and God's mercy. All of those things that we don't deserve, but thank God, God gives it to us anyway. And in those moments, we can be merciful, we can be kind, we can be gracious, we can be forgiving to one another, and raise up the dignity given us all by God. Young man, get up, are the words of Jesus in the gospel. Today, young lady, get up. Old lady, get up. Old man, get up. Young man, get up. Every child, get up. Today, God has brought life and abundance to us all. May we be ready to receive that gift here and every day of our lives. Amen.